for joining us, Laura.
Sure, my pleasure.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
So, Laura, I know you from New York. You've been in Climate Countdown. Tell us a little bit about the Deep Decarbonisation Pathways project that you lead, just so we can kind of set up what you're working on.
Yes, so the Deep Decarbonisation Pathways project is a project that's aimed at understanding what an actual sort of roadmap to decarbonization of energy systems would look like, essentially. So we're taking a little bit of a longer term approach. We're looking at 2050 and where we need to be in terms of emissions to stay within the 2-degree C limit. And we're working backwards to understand what the physical transformations of energy systems need to be in order to get us there. And we're working in 16 countries that cover about 75% of world emissions. So the largest emitters, big industrialized economies, but also the biggest emerging economies.
Okay.
And clearly with very different sort of problems and to solve for in each of these countries, yeah.
So I should also say, Naomi, that you're a bit sick, so you have very little voice. So.
Yeah, so I'll be listening and maybe asking one question.
So you're working with implementation. We also have a funny noise. I should also say that. We're working strong today.
Yes.
So you're working on implementation, which is why we came to you for Climate Countdown. And here we are at COP. Can you talk a little bit about how implementation is being included or talked about, or is it within the agreement and the negotiations?
Well, the short answer is that it's not right now. So it seems to me, again, as an outsider, because clearly I'm an observer in the negotiations process. I'm not an actual negotiator. I don't represent any country's specific negotiating position. But it seems to me that while a lot of the discussions are sort of focused on some either higher level issues, such as should we have a 1.5 degree or a 2 degree limit that we are trying to stay within, and then a lot of discussions are on process, on UNFCCC process, but there isn't much of a discussion about, okay, if we set ourselves this limit, whether it's 1.5 or 2 degrees, honestly, it doesn't really make much of a difference. The whole point is, how do we transform our economies to get there? And that aspect is completely absent from the negotiations, from what I could see. So it's almost like this disconnect between the high level objectives that everybody agreed already in Copenhagen and Cancun, that we need to stay within these limits that science considers safe. And in fact, 1.5 is already referenced in the Cancun agreement, so it's nothing new, really. But the point is that we haven't really discussed how to get there, and it's like we are meeting every year and we still are not really focused on what really matters, which is how do we implement this transformation?
So the one I was wondering about that. We were talking about 1.5 and 2 yesterday.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's value in like saying we're going to do it and then figuring out, because I mean what your work shows is that we can actually do it if we just do it.
Yes, exactly.
I guess there's danger of talking too much about what we're going to do and not doing it, but do you think that setting ambitious goals is still important and then kind of figuring out the how?
I think that yes, it is important to set an ambitious goal. But I feel like the more we discuss about the goals and the less we focus on actually sort of meeting it, then we're kind of wasting time. Yeah. And the reality is that yes, our scenarios show that the modeling work of all these different 16 country teams shows that transforming energy systems to in a way that is compatible with decarbonization in the second half of the century. So we're looking at 2050, but our objective is to get to zero carbon, by 2070 or so. So that's technically feasible with the technologies that we have today. We discussed this in Climate Countdown, right? Clearly, assuming that they will get better and less expensive. That's obviously part of the assumptions, but it is possible. But the reality is that the more we wait, and the more, well, number one, this result will be out of reach, or it'll be much more expensive to get there. Now, and I think that it's really, this is where political will is really important. I was having these interesting conversations, and somebody quoted this, talking about political will, they quoted somebody from the Rainforest Action Alliance, I think, and they were saying, this transformation that we need in energy systems is something that humanity has never had to essentially accomplish. It's never been done before, essentially. So I don't know if we can do it because it's never been done before. Well, we are saying yes, we can do it. True, it's never been done before. And then somebody made the point that, but yes, we actually are capable of doing that when it comes to wars. Like, think about war efforts and how quickly actually countries can ramp up their efforts in terms of producing, weapons, etc.
Or putting a man on the moon. Or
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then this guy said, okay, so we are willing to do it for war, but not to save the planet. And I thought that was very powerful, because he's so right. We're finding all these excuses, but at the end of the day, I mean, it's something that if we really wanted to do, we could do, basically. So, yeah.
Wow. And so long term, you mentioned long term, and we have these INDCs. Maybe talk a little bit about where the INDCs get us and kind of, are we thinking long term enough?
No, we are not. So the INDCs, which are these plans for emissions reductions that almost all countries participating in the convention have actually submitted to the process, which was, by the way, a huge step forward, because that kind of broke the impasse of differentiating between countries that were already industrialized. It's essentially the Annex 1 versus non-Annex 1 countries, right? So industrialized, developed countries that have historically contributed to this problem versus developing countries that have not contributed to this problem because their emissions levels are very low but are growing, so they will be part of the issue in the future. So this really broke this, I think, political impasse, which was really powerful. However, INDCs really only look at 2025, 2030. This is the horizon of INDCs, and there's a couple issues in that. I mean, and the first one and the most important being that you can actually envisage a lot of short-term actions that can mitigate, like reduce emissions by a certain amount, even significant within the short term. But typically, all these mitigation efforts are going to be able to deliver these emission reductions only for a very short amount of time. I'm thinking, for example, of the transition from coal to gas. So you can certainly reduce emissions by about a quarter, like 25%, if you switch your power system from coal to gas. But the problem is that you're going to be locked into these high emissions going into the future. And so essentially that long-term pathway to decarbonization is out of reach. Right. So if we compare, where we need to be in 2030, in 2030 in our scenarios, let's say like deep decarbonization scenarios versus some of the INDCs, if you just cut it off at 2030, they might actually be sort of close. We see, emissions peaking and then plateauing or coming down, etc. So that's good. However, if you look out into the future, their curve is going to go stay flat or maybe even grow a little, and our curve needs to go down a lot. So that's really the big difference. And that's why it's important to actually have a long-term view on these things, because once you invest in energy infrastructure, that's going to be around for 40 years. It's not going to be around for 15 years. And if you have to replace it before the end of its useful life, it's going to be very expensive. And so you want to make sure that you invest in the right things right away, because otherwise it's going to cost you a whole lot more. To invest in the wrong stuff now, having to replace it, scrap it, do something else, that's expensive. And we're trying to say, let's try to spend this money, wisely. Let's try not to strand all this capital in the wrong things.
So we were talking before about what the world looks like in 2050.
I think that what our viewers are, many of them are going to be in the United States. So I think it'd be interesting if you talked a little bit about what does the world look like in the United States following a decarbonization pathway as you describe it. Kind of like
in the United States, or
for instance, yeah. So
well, in the United States, I guess we can take the United States example as an example of a country where you have a lot of legacy infrastructure. So like all industrialized countries are facing pretty much the same issue. What do you do with the networks? How do you really structure your energy system? The system is going to look somewhat similar to today. You will have, but with a lot of differences. You'll probably have the same amount of cars, but they all have to be electrified. You will have the same amount of appliances inside buildings, but they all have to be much, much more efficient. And we will have the same amount of power generation capacity, but it will have to be significantly different from what it is today. Certainly no coal, certainly or very little, and no coal if it doesn't have the capacity to capture CO2 and store it, and some nuclear power possibly. So this is really what we're looking at. We're looking at a system where all the energy services are maintained at the same level of today or higher, but the systems need to be able to deliver that with almost zero carbon, basically. So when we think about this transformation, we think around these three pillars. That's of the deep decarbonization pathways project. So number one is energy efficiency in all energy uses. Number two is the decarbonization of the power system. And number three is fuel switching, so from whatever is fossil today to zero carbon or very low carbon. So it means electrifying a lot of end uses, or in cases where that's not possible, think about, air transport or freight or things like that, then switch to low carbon fuel. So that's really the idea. So I'm not sure that we will see the difference necessarily a lot, but it will be done fundamentally differently from what it is today. Yeah.
I think that's interesting that, like, from the consumer side,
yeah,
that it really is just going to be kind of cooler cars and like cleaner air, and
yes.
If we actually go ahead and do this in the right way.
Yeah, I think so. There will also be, I don't want to, clearly there will also be like a lot more solar rooftops and like all these sort of like smaller renewable distributed generation capacity, but the system in places like the US is not going to change fundamentally. There's still going to be a role for utilities to play. The networks are going to be in place, and possibly the gas pipelines are going to be used to transport some other low carbon fuel. So you can basically use all this infrastructure, but in a way that is compatible with a low carbon or zero carbon economy. In developing countries, I think that's still a little bit sort of open for interpretation, and they have an opportunity to really build out an energy system in a completely different way. And so we have different teams that have taken very different approaches in our project. Very interesting, but we haven't really looked at countries that are like of the least developed countries type, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, etc., where you really have no infrastructure in place. So I think that will be a next sort of interesting step, trying to understand what the transformation looks like in those places. They're not even decarbonizing necessarily because their carbon emissions are so low, but they're going to build sort of a climate resilient or a zero carbon energy infrastructure and develop that way, which I think could be really cool. So yeah,
that's really interesting. So if we get this agreement out of Paris that doesn't really have implementation, and they set either a very ambitious goal or a not as ambitious goal, we'll see. How do we then, how can we work on the periphery of that to implement? Are you doing that here, trying to make connections in terms of implementing?
No, of course. So it looks like what's coming out of Paris is an agreement where any kind of binding mitigation targets are off the table. What's going to be binding is part of the process, in the sense that countries are going to be invited to submit these plans, these INDCs, which I think are going to be INDCs without the I, so nationally determined contributions instead of intended. Yes, they're going to have to be real. So we're moving towards that world with periodic reviews, etc. But let's keep in mind that, like you said, where we are today with these INDCs in 2030, there are some people that have aggregated this and kind of tried to figure out what this means in terms of temperature change. We're somewhere between 2.7 and 3.5 degrees temperature change. So we're way past the 2-degree limit without even mentioning the 1.5 degrees. So yes, clearly the game will be played on implementation. I think that there are a lot of positive signals. There are countries like the US and China have agreed that they would put forth a plan, an official plan, for long-term decarbonization of their economies. This was about a year ago or so in October, a joint declaration between the two presidents. So that was very encouraging. I think that this idea that we need to start looking long-term and figure out how to get there is sort of slowly, percolating through. A lot of politicians, I have to say, are just not aware of the complications and the technicalities of the energy systems. This is something where you need engineers, you need scientists, you just need a huge effort, of all these different communities coming together. We are trying to do a better job at doing that in our project, sort of, outreaching and sort of educating policymakers, people that have the power to make actual decision and actual change. And I think that a lot of it will be played on that sort of, in that court in the next few years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for helping us.
Thank you
understand
guys.
that,
Always
and,
a pleasure.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thank
and
you.
hopefully
Cheers.
we can actually get this implemented.
Well, yeah, maybe. We'll see. We'll
just
see.
do it.
Let's just hope they'll sign something on Friday.
There you go. Deciding something on Friday.
Cheers.
Deciding something on Friday.
Citizens' Voice.
Citizens' voice.
Citizens' voice.
Citizens' Voice.
Citizens' voice.